So, good morning, everybody. That's not a very warm World Bank. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Welcome to our session this morning titled The Private Sector in Fragile Situations, #GetTheJobDone. My name's Rahm and I'm a presenter on BBC World Television. And just a few housekeeping notes that this session is being live streamed in French, English, Arabic and Spanish for social media commentary, and we do encourage you to take the conversation online. Our hashtag is #GetTheJobDone. Certainly get this job done. Not concerned what's happening in Britain at the moment. And let me begin with some quotable quotes, certainly words that you would have heard before. So John Steinbeck once said, "All war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking animal," and by this he meant a person or a species. All war is a symptom of man's failure as a thinking and rational person. And then added to that, Ronald Reagan said, "Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the inability to resolve conflict by peaceful means." Why am I reminding you of these quotes? It's because it's the essence of why we're here today. We are looking at fragile countries, conflict, strife-ridden countries, where there's been very little peace, but where that peace can be achieved through rational, thoughtful interventions, and not just from the politicians, but by the development community and the private sector at large. This morning, our seminar, which is hosted by the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank, is looking at these rational approaches to peace building, to creating and harnessing productive societies. And we truly believe that the private sector is a lever to that reconstruction, rehabilitation, and rebuilding of these societies. An important thing, I think, to recognize is no matter the trauma that people have undergone, individuals and citizens in some of these countries, and indeed as displaced people, are still effectively a consumer base. They're still an aspirational people. They still want to transact and have a measure of independence in how they live and run their lives. And the conversation we're having here today is to show you the tools that will enable them to reclaim that independence and ultimately reestablish a semblance of normality and dignity in how they live their lives. The cue cards that I've asked you to look at are summations of some of the salient points from the research that's been conducted. That will informs right now the synthesis on the work that's being done by the IEG, but ultimately will be at the center of the first strategy to be published and reported on next month. So without further ado, let us get the job done. And what I'd like to do is introduce you to Aileen Sarah. She's a social entrepreneur who's been working in Lebanon with Syrian refugees, for her to tell us how you bring this community together and give them jobs. So Aileen, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for hosting me to the World Bank. It's an honor to be able to share with you about نتكلم. Who here speaks Arabic? So for those who speak Arabic, you know that نتكلم means we speak. So just a few quick notes to frame this discussion. So I will be talking about the refugee crisis, and when I talk about refugees, I mean refugees in the larger sense, including IDPs and asylum seekers. And yes, نتكلم emerged out of the MENA region, so lots of what I'll talk about will be slightly more specific to that part of the world, though in line with what startups stand for, it is a scalable model. So I don't need to talk too much and dwell on this, but we're facing the worst refugee crisis of our time. 70 million people who are forced to flee their homes. From a resettlement perspective, only 1% of individuals actually get resettled, which means they get to places like the US, Canada, Europe, where they are given a right to restart their lives and work. The vast majority of individuals remain stuck in limbo at border crossings and camps in countries that don't give them a right to work. Yet, so they're cut off from access to an income, and yet millions of them are highly educated, and they're also highly connected. So we're living in the era of the connected refugee. This is a photo of a refugee camp in Greece. We've interviewed biochemical engineers, we've interviewed doctors, artists, architects. And so while we're living this refugee crisis, there's also on the other side a growing demand for global language learning services. So Natakallam was born on these two premises. So we'll take someone like Noor, a Syrian refugee who fled from Raqqa, the capital of ISIS, back a couple years ago. She's a biology teacher. She comes to Lebanon. She has no right to work. Yet through Natakallam, what she does is she connects every week to Kate, a PhD student in Baltimore studying the Middle East, who is looking to practice her Arabic. And on the one end, Noor gets access to an income, a restored sense of dignity and purpose, while Kate gets affordable, flexible language practice that directly contributes to the livelihood of her refugee partner. So Natakallam is operating at the intersection of three main pillars: the fact that there are millions of highly skilled, connected refugees, that there is a growing demand for language and cultural exchange services, and that we live also in the era of the gig economy, which is a pathway to digital inclusion for the displaced. So from our original one-on-one language learning service, we've actually expanded. We include multiple languages today. We also have curated academic programs and in schools and universities that are focused on the concept of displacement, but also language learning. And more recently, we've identified another offering, which is translation services, which can be done remotely by skilled refugees worldwide. So as a startup, speaking a bit about our revenue, since launching, we've generated over $1 million in sales, and that translates to over 6,000 unique users worldwide in dozens of countries, with partnerships with over 200 schools and universities and organizational clients, mostly using us for translation services. So in total, we've been able to disperse over $650,000 to refugees. Just to give you a sense, some of our academic clients include major US schools. GW is actually one of the first schools to reach out to Natakallam to bring it to its classrooms. And organizational clients range from large nonprofits to more and increasingly so the private sector. So we attribute what we consider relatively successful for a startup to the fact that our team is multicultural and multi-talented, in the sense that we understand both the demand and the supply of our market. We're humanitarians. We have individuals with expertise in international development, but also linguistics, education, and virtual exchange. And we really believe that cross-sectional partnerships are at the core of what we do and why we've achieved what we've achieved. We actually launched by working with a small local Lebanese NGO in Beirut, and that's what brought us to life from the get-go. So just, of course, we're at the World Bank, so I don't need to also talk too much about the fact that climate change will displace another 140 million people by 2050, according to reports. So finding a way of including the displaced and giving them access to a livelihood is absolutely crucial. And a few quick points on the startup mindset in this context. So we are a market-based solution, and as a small startup, we are able to take much more risk. We're much more nimble. We started very specific, originally with Levantine Arabic, focused in Lebanon with Syrian refugees. We've expanded both with our Arabic to support Yemeni, Iraqi, Egyptian, number of Arabic-speaking communities, but also Farsi with Iranians, Dari with Afghans, Spanish Venezuelans and Central Americans, and more recently French with Francophone African individuals. So we really started specific and did rapid prototyping, and that's how we've gotten to where we are today. We think that refugees are not beneficiaries, but more customers. So we report to our customers both the refugees, but also the language clients. And the refugees are not passive recipients to aid, but sustainably self-generating their income. And of course, technology does have a role as a critical enabler for us to transcend borders. Challenges so far have been kind of relatively classic, stereotyping and prejudice against refugees, figuring out how to get payments to refugees in places like Iraq and Lebanon. There have been some duplicate efforts and competition that is not necessarily productive. From an investor perspective, there is a big lack of patient capital, in our opinion. Lots of talk, not actual investment. And small enterprises are not always included at the big table, the major discussions, because there tends to be this private-public sector idea, but with large nonprofits and large institutions. But the small actors have a critical role to play. And just speaking from more of the startup journey, Netakalem has achieved all this with very basic low tech. So our next step is really, now that we've proven our solution and our product, is scaling that up through technology, increased marketing, internal capacity building, supporting the refugees a bit more with more comprehensive training than B2B sales and language expansion. So finally, a closing statement to reflect that well beyond the income, the monetary value of what Netakalem does, it is also about dignity, about providing a sense of identity to individuals who've lost everything, who are not necessarily spoken about positively by many of our global leaders, and it is ultimately building bridges and changing the narrative around refugees. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Aileen. If I may ask you to take your seat, and I'll introduce the rest of the panel. So please welcome warmly Abdurrahman Dulay Bailey, who is the Minister of Finance in Somalia. We also have Max von Bonschhoff, who is the Director for Development Finance and Private Cooperation in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Finland. We have Suprotik Basu, who's the founder of Orange Sustainable Capital. And of course, Aileen stays with us. So, gentlemen, please.
Thank you.
We almost got the gender parity right, but next year. Perfect. All right, thanks so much, gentlemen, for coming through. So let me start with you, Suprotik, because I'm going to just pigeonhole you as the capitalist on the panel. And I know that's not fair. You've had an extensive career at the UN and here at the World Bank. So honestly, you've worked the spectrum, as it were. But when I think private sector, the words that come to my mind are profits, shareholder value, minimizing the risk. What would be the incentive for the private sector to roll out loads of capital in these fragile economies?
Well, I think you often hear about, the focus tends to be on returns, as you say, shareholder value. But in the conversation on returns, we forget the other side of returns is a risk-adjusted return, right? And we've just heard from Aileen, there are opportunities in these markets, but it's a relatively narrow group of investors right now that are willing to stomach or even tolerate the risk-adjusted return environment. So we have to find a way to kind of broaden that pool. And sometimes I think the transactional friction to getting deals done in these markets can be so high for relatively small investments. We need to think much more about that risk-return balance. And the reality is we're in such a low-yield environment, and if we can think of risk aggregation mechanisms, maybe you find a way to crowd in more of that private capital and take more risk. I think the capital is there, but I think the transactional friction can be quite high to getting a deal done.
All right, we'll discuss those modalities in a second. Max von Bonschhoff, let's get a view from you. There is a category called development assistance. You would know that very, very well. And it's a legitimate space in which money, at the sovereign level, yes, but is rolled out to assist, not exclusively fragile economies, but targeting some of these weaker, smaller, fragile economies. Shouldn't the focus be on development assistance initially, and then perhaps when a country is more stable, bring in the private sector, or can the two work in synergy?
Thank you very much. Very important questions. I think you need development assistance of various forms in fragile and conflict affected situation. And I think you need different kinds of aids. You need grant assistance, but you also need investment to the private sector for job creation. And I think there is a growing need for partnerships among bilateral donors, IFIs, development finance institutions, to create funding modalities which allows institutions like IFC and others to take more risk and go to and invest in the SME sector in fragile context. So I think there's opportunities to do both.
Minister Dulai Bailey.
Yes.
Can we get an anecdotal perspective? So Somalia has known decades of conflict, violence and instability.
Yes.
And yet, Somalia annually is able to trade around $1 billion US. And those are just trackable statistics. So we don't even know the pools of money that haven't been traced. How do people operate in those kinds of environments, an environment like Somalia?
Thank you very much. And I want to thank the World Bank Department of Evaluation for organizing this. I think this is a very important discussion that we're having. It's talking about two things that are very important for us, Somalia: business, private sector, and fragility. And we are hosting both of them, fragility and business. Let me divide the private sector into two, or private sector investment into two, as far as Somalia is concerned. One is the international capital movement and international investment, and the other one is private businesses. Somalia, as you said, has been in fragile situation for many years, even though now it's becoming lively and it's coming out of that. It is because of our businesses. Somalis are by nature business people, and if Somalia is still there, given all the problems that it had, I would say, for the record, is for two reasons. One is private sector, and the other one is Somali women. Honest to God, that these are the two issues that kept Somalia afloat, given all the problems that we had. And I salute both of them. Our private sector, everywhere in the world, are sending money, 2 billion or more every year. They are bringing back now their money to Mogadishu and around, and really helping the country come out of the problems. They are the ones paying the taxes now. What can I talk about other than taxes? The finance minister always talks about taxes, right? And they are the ones who are paying our bills, more and more every year. They are the ones who are now utilizing the mobile money, which is #1 in Africa today. Billions of money moving around by your telephone. The Shu China has a system. You send the money through his system. Everybody has it. Okay. You want to buy a tomato or potato or something, it's mobile money. These are the business people who are... Now, briefly, on the other side, which we need so badly, we are still waiting for the arrears to be cleared with the international community. We had a very important discussion yesterday, roundtable for Somalia, and it went very well. So to an extent that by early next year, we will be out of arrears and therefore get access to the international. But security is still an issue, and we're working on that.
Okay. Eileen, just from your vantage point, I want to look at the range of investment opportunities that you see in fragile states. So you're obviously working with an online platform.
Yes.
In education. But where else, in terms of these sustainable and human development needs, can the private sector come through?
I mean, I think what's interesting is the fact that we're online does create a certain level of stability compared to being just physically located in certain zones. So I think from Netakalem's perspective, we've been really able to find something that provides some sort of security. Now, as a social entrepreneur, Netakalem has actually, we're a for-profit social enterprise. We debated for over a year, as I shared with you, about that status. But it's a decision we've made, yet so far we haven't gone for traditional investment. Netakalem has been operating off of its self-generated revenue, and we have been getting a lot of traction in the competition space, so startup competitions, and as well foundations. So I think from what I've experienced, there is still too much, there's a lack of will to wait for returns that will take a bit longer and that have a greater risk. And I think that slowly, hopefully, and surely, the mindset is changing. And I think that it just even requires not only just thinking patiently and accepting that the returns might come later on, but I also think there needs to be a whole reframing of thinking outside of the box.
For the purposes of our audience that haven't had this conversation,
Yes.
why did you struggle with the idea of your social enterprise being a for-profit business?
Well, our team is grounded in the humanitarian, human rights background, and it is very important for us to make sure that our impact doesn't get sacrificed at the expense of returns. What's incredible is that there is a significant commercial opportunity in what we've found, which is the language industry, the language sector, translation, et cetera. So we're warming up to the idea, but I would say that because we're not this classic startup that is launching a company with the idea of bringing in returns, but really the impact is critical. We have been more patient and much more focused on our impact than actually the profits. And we've been, to be honest, as humanitarians, we're scrappy. So we are able to deal with limited resources. But I think what's been nice is that, we're 4 years old and we've achieved this nice, steady growth. Right. And we also didn't want to take anyone's money without being able to bring some impact. So now it's kind of that inflection point where hopefully we can be more convincing with the investors.
Max, I'd like to bring you into the conversation because I live and work on the African continent, and fortunately there's a lot more democracy, a lot more peace, so we're not really dealing with fragile states, but we are seeing where there's a need and big capital's not willing to go in. So you're seeing social enterprise in education, for instance, aspects of fintech, but healthcare is doing really well. We're seeing drone delivery of medications, agri-tech. So for an investor sitting here saying, tell me where I could have a meaningful impact and still make some money, where is it? Not where country-wise, but what sectors?
Well, I would sort of give an example. So in Finland, we have this sort of NGO, Finchurch Aid. It's the biggest sort of development NGO in Finland, and it's worked for a long time on a sort of providing grants to local NGOs in fragile and conflict situations, among other things, in Somalia. And they draw the conclusion sort of a few years back that in addition to what they were doing, they also saw the need of patient capital, and that sort of, in addition for them to be impactful in terms of poverty reduction, and they needed also the opportunity to, in addition to providing grant, to invest in local SMEs. So, they've, in addition to their early operations, they've started sort of some time back sort of developing an impact investment arm of the NGO. And so as a government, we provided them a long-term loan capital for them to be able to sort of start sort of NGO-based sort of impact investment company. So just an example that there are opportunities, and in terms of sectors, I think there's a lot of opportunities in many sectors and in the agriculture and manufacturing, etc. But sort of but I see what is needed is players with different kind of sort of experience, from NGOs to more experienced or bigger IFIs.
So Protek, this is where the whole question of different financial models comes into the fray. We're hearing of an aspect of impact investing. What else is available, and where, you know, big capital can pair and partner in a meaningful way?
Yeah, I think the rhetoric reality divide gap when it comes to big capital getting involved in these situations is not small. That means there's the intent, but it means the instruments have yet to catch up. And what has been done has been relatively small scale, and what has been done have been largely variations on debt instruments, right? And basically AAA wrapped, et cetera, nice and safe. And what we've not been able to do is get investors in these contexts up that risk-return curve. So in some ways, we need new mechanisms, new instruments to be developed. At the same time, you have this growing demand, almost like a dam with water behind it that's going to break when it comes to this impact investing, sustainable investing movement. Again, there's a broad definition of that, but you know, according to the Global Impact Investing Network, we've gone from $250 billion last year to around a $500 billion per annum industry now. That's only going to increase over time. So I think you're finding more and more investors willing to take more risk, longer durations, more patient capital. But the challenge has been one of translation and brokering. But at a certain point, that dam will break, and clearly the demands and the needs are there. So we need to prove that we can do it at some aggregated scale.
When you say patient, how patient should this capital be?
Depends on who's knocking on your door on the investment side behind you. If you're, you know, I think in some ways the classic private equity fund structure is an awkward structure for things like this, right? You're talking about 5, 7, 10-year funds. Limited partners are only so patient. If you're you've got all this money locked up in pension funds, for example, where their primary impact is to provide some pensioner in Northern Ontario with their pension on time. So they're only able to take so much risk and be so patient. So it really depends on where the asset owner funding is coming from. I'm very focused more and more on these. There's these massive latent pools of capital out there that really fascinate me. Take donor advised funds. There's over $100+ billion in donor advised funds sitting there. They're doing basically nothing, right? The investor's taking the tax write-off. The money is often not invested. So I think there are these pools that are out there that can afford to be a bit more patient than a classic, New York private equity fund structure that we need to access and tap into.
In fact, this is a question I'd like to ask all of you. I'll start with you. I'll stay with you, Project. This idea of risk. How do you measure risk? How do you price it in? And really, what is risk in the context of a fragile economy?
It's a great question, and the pricing is tough. I just speak personally. I think one of the biggest risks is a governance risk, right? It's for example, if you're booking a private loan in an environment that is fragile, when there's no legal precedent for how that loan is treated in the event of a bankruptcy or liquidation, it puts the investor in a very challenging position. It puts you in a very awkward position when you explain that risk that you're taking on the limited partner side. That's one such. Obviously, there's execution risk. But I actually think there's, again, in this low yield environment, there's appetite to take more risk. You just have to have reasonable, I'm not saying guarantee the risk fully, but reasonable risk mitigation instruments that come along with you up that risk return curve. And ideally, the more you do this, you can start dialing down the dials when it comes to the risk mitigation, because I actually think some of the risk is mispriced. I actually think you can get more done than people think.
Minister, that's an investor speaking. Simply, some people just say political risk, that's the thing.
Yes.
I don't know if I come and invest in a factory in Somalia, is a bomb going to go off 2 months from now, and what happens to my asset?
It's very correct. I think political risk is a very important risk that has to be mitigated. And as far as Somalia is concerned, we are aware of that. We are therefore addressing the issue of security, physical security. We are also addressing the issue of putting in place necessary laws and regulations through the parliament, through the system, so that people who come to the country and invest have the comfort of laws and regulations and way to deal with them. But all that, we are a country that is starting from a clean slate. And therefore, the investment need requirement is there. You name it, there is a demand. You name it, the industry area, the education area, the health area. It's a country that has been totally leveled and now coming out. So really, we are looking forward to the arrears clearance with the international community so that public sector and private sector investors can come and look the risk appetite, as Basu said, Mr. Basu said, is company specific, and therefore we welcome everybody to come to the country, look around, and look at our laws and our regulations and the government procedures and policies. And I am sure they will find a niche.
Right. Max, a two-pronged question. There's another kind of risk, a regulatory risk, a risk of default on loans, if we're talking about loans. And then there's the issue of being able to monitor and evaluate some of these loans to make sure that these governments are accountable, ultimately, because this is taxpayers' money from abroad, ultimately, and somebody's got to be accountable for it.
Yeah, I think if you talk about risk, I think from a donor perspective and a government accountability sort of perspective, I think the biggest risk issue is the risks that we won't achieve together with our partners, be they government or private sector, the development impact that one wants to achieve. So that's the biggest risk here, and I think the approach we take. I think sort of donors and governments with ODA funds of various sorts at their disposal have the ability to partner with institutions, DFIs or private sector to create funding modalities, programs which help sort of to reduce risk of various sorts and sort of increase the appetite to invest in the most sort of difficult environments. But I think we have to sort of, when we talk about risk, that's the risk on the development impact side, sort of, that's really the key.
Okay, at this juncture, I think I have one more question, and then I'd like to open questions to the floor. But just so that we get a sense of what your thinking is at the floor, you all looked at the cue cards, you all read them. So by a show of hands, I've literally paraphrased the cue cards to extract key concepts. How many of you think the biggest issue for the private sector getting the job done in these fragile economies is going to be corporate governance? Okay. How many of you believe that it is job creation for displaced people and host communities? You're assessing it, right? How many of you believe it's investments that develop linkages with local businesses? How many of you believe that it's about catalyzing solutions, such as the example in your cue card about how the IFC helped with sustaining and supporting the telecoms regulatory environment in a particular case? Just one. Thank you for your lone voice. How many of you believe that what's really needed is to make simple and small interventions, the things that loosen constraints? How many of you believe what's required is better collaboration across institutions? And how many believe that if the private sector is brought in at the earlier stage, humanitarian missions and the like, that's what's really going to unlock the potential? Okay, so I saw 4 things that the audience believes are more important. Investments that help to develop the local business community. What are those investments? What's required? From Somalia, what did you see?
Well, I would have also raised my hand for that. It is very important that international investment works very closely with the local community and local investors because the local businesses know the local environment and the local laws and rules, and it's always good that you do business with them. They also know what laws apply anywhere, and they know the employment law, the labor law, and so I think that is a very important start.
Right.
Especially in fragile states where you are not very sure what will come out.
Max, another issue that the audience says is important are the small and simple interventions that loosen constraints. Could you talk us through your own experiences?
Well, I think sort of you need sort of strong partnerships and among players who have experience in working in fragile environments, and I think with sort of partnering among organizations and institutions and businesses who have experience working in fragile sort of context, sort of, I think there are sort of a lot of opportunities, and I was telling earlier about sort of this NGO that we have supporting. Sort of, I mean, they have sort of experience in working in sort of refugee camps and supporting sort of entrepreneurial skills, and so sort of their experience that even sort of quite simple, small scale sort of opportunities are there. You just need sort of partnership players who have the experience in working this environment, and then being able to support them so can sort of help small-scale initiatives grow sort of well.
So, Protek, I'd like you to wear your World Bank hat, your UN hat, your private sector hat, and talk to us about this concept of collaboration. I know that here they're talking about collaboration amongst the multilaterals within the World Bank group, but how do we just make sure everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet?
I guess, I mean, these deals are hard, right? I think we shouldn't be under any illusion of that. And I think one of the challenges of at least crowding in private capital is that there are enough deals to be done elsewhere that don't have these hurdles. And so I think on the collaboration point, oftentimes what's missing is a broker, right? In which you'd have in the private sector almost the investment banker, someone to, in some ways you're often speaking entirely different languages, right? So that missing broker that's able to help get the deal done, that understands the different arrows in your quiver from a risk mitigation standpoint, that understands the constraints of what a private investor is going through, that understands the local partner that's critical to getting the work actually done and their cash flow needs. It's in some ways in no one's incentive to do that, but it's in the entire deal's incentive to get that done. And I often find that if you had that broker who's able to, or even that deal team who can help put the deal together, transaction together, it then reduces the threshold, I think, of all those parties to come to the table and have the conversation. So that collaboration is just, it's fundamental.
So one more question to you, Aileen, and then we're taking questions to the floor. I just want to know about this idea of creating jobs, because ultimately displaced people, refugees, asylum seekers have limited status when they're in a host country. And often they don't have the right to work. So how do we get around some of those legal issues as to the status of people in fragile countries?
Yeah, I mean, it's a big problem, and I think recognizing, contextualizing the situation is very important. So giving work permits to Syrians in the Middle East versus giving work permits to Venezuelans in the Latin American countries they fled to have very different ramifications from a geopolitical perspective. What I would say is, I think that we sometimes always want to go for the long shot too quickly. So it's funny, we don't consider what we're doing for refugees the final answer. We're a stepping stone to refugees so that they don't fall into complete despair and give up. So because we've had several refugees who've worked with us for several years, managed to get resettled through people they've met, right? Because when you're a refugee, you don't only lose your financial capital, you lose your social capital. So we're creating a virtual network where through these engagements, meeting the world through their computer screen, we've had several refugees get resettled, get other jobs. So I think our lens at Natakalem was not full on getting a job with getting an income, because that's actually a critical stepping stone that helps salvage such a significant human capital that might be of risk of being lost. So I think I'd speak for Netakalem as we feel we're more that stepping stone, because we actually thought more simply like an immediate income, because otherwise in the interim, what's going to happen?
Fantastic. All right, how many people would like to ask questions so that we can get the microphones to you? There's a question at the back. Please stand up, ma'am. Any other questions near the front? So, ma'am, then we come to the front. Yes.
Hello, thank you for this. My name is Jessica Wade, and I work at the MIGA, so Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, which is part of the World Bank. So you may know that in terms of the mitigants that you were speaking about earlier, we do provide political risk insurance to foreign investors who are coming into developing countries. And in terms of the collaboration that you were speaking about, when we are in particularly fragile situations, we can reach out to the private sector window, which is offered by IDA, and they will help us in a loss-sharing mechanism to help us do more in places that would otherwise be very challenging. And there was a talk about development impact as well. We're scrutinized very closely on what development impact our projects contribute to the countries where we're operating. So it's something that's very important to our board and also to our investors as well. So I wanted to go back to the mitigants question and ask, what other mitigants do you look for, besides perhaps political risk insurance offered by MIGA and others? What else helps investors get comfortable in these situations? Thank you.
Fantastic. Could the microphone come forward to the second row? Oh, you've got one. Yes, sir.
My name is Rahm. I work for Partnership for Transparency. Excellent presentations, and very glad to see the innovative features of what Ms. Sarah was doing in the refugee camps. We need more of that. One of the areas is ensuring security, which is really fundamental for any private investor or businesses to come and invest in fragile situations. Do you think the international community, the donor community, as well as institutions like the World Bank and all, should play a more active role in providing that security? Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Yes, sir.
Greetings. Hello, my name is Joe Dever. I work with the USAID Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance. You all have spoken a good bit today about job creation and about global capital and investment going into these difficult areas. But I was wondering if you could address the issue of the very basic domestic, local private sector trying to work in difficult places. For example, let's say there was shea nut production in Somalia. I don't know if there is that far east, but what if traders and oilseed companies wanted to source shea nuts from rural areas in Somalia? What about an agro-input firm wanting to extend fertilizer and seed, hermetic bag sales into northern Nigeria, or a livestock trader trying to get cattle moved from Niger and Burkina to the coastal cities, but now they have to worry about caches of illegal arms being moved around West Africa. What about those kind of supply chain security issues that affect the small enterprises, the very local private sector? Maybe if one of you could address what you've seen in that space.
I think that's an important one. Shall we begin with the last question? Because there is the international investment community, and then there's the domestic. And an important point that was raised, certainly that comes through the research, is that the local private sector don't have the option to leave.
Right.
They don't leave. They are there, and they've been through the worst.
Right. Well, I think that local private sector, and again, we've been fairly homogeneous in how we've defined private sector, even in this panel conversation, right? It's such as me noted. I mean, the local private sector from a delivery standpoint, as well as the local private sector from an investor standpoint, is essential. And they understand the risks and the rewards better than any international one coming in, right? I think one of the issues, so I agree, there's massive opportunity there, Joe. I think one of the challenges is the aggregation ability and sometimes the deal size and the amount of work it's required to for these smaller investments and what kind of capital, the scale of capital they can attract. And I think for an international investor, sometimes that scale can be relatively small, given the amount of work, time it takes to actually get the deal done. So I'm personally fascinated by, are there ways you can kind of aggregate pools of capital and de-risk that in a more layered, aggregated way than doing it deal by deal? I also wanted to talk to the MEGA point, but we can get to that later if you'd like.
Go ahead.
So on the I didn't catch your name, the woman from Jessica. Thanks for the question, Jessica. So, so MEGA's obviously doing fantastic work as an essential piece of the investment architecture. But even take that political risk insurance element that MEGA essentially provides. One of the issues, just speaking from an investor standpoint, is the time it takes to cure that political risk can often be intolerable, right? So while I know the insurance is there and there's a price for it and it's worth paying, if it then takes whatever, X amount of time, 1 year, 2 years to actually essentially call down on that to mitigate that political risk, I've gotten wiped out in those 2 years, right? I can't afford to have the process take that long. And so even as we think about different risk mitigation mechanisms, it's the overall, and there are many other risks we can, there's guarantees and wraps and first loss and all sorts of things you can do. But one element that certainly I come across from a practical standpoint is the time it takes for some of the systems to kick those risk mitigants in, and you just can't afford to bleed cash during those time periods while the system works on the risk mitigation mechanism.
Max?
Thanks very much. I wanted to build sort of on the point and the question on the local domestic economy and its role, and it's very crucial and for job creation, etc. And I think sort of, you mentioned sort of a few of the constraints, and often sort of SME-related projects are small, and there's a lot of sort of transactional cost there. I think in these kind of environments, I think sort of government and donors have a role. For instance, with funding initiative, with helps in sort of project building and technical assistance, capacity building on one hand. On the other hand, in terms of supporting building of program and funding facilities, which sort of de-risk sort of more sort of private capital, international capital to come in sort of to the kind of SME environments which you talk about, and overcoming the constraints. But the role of the domestic economy and productive capacity is really crucial for development impacts.
Just before you say something, Minister, let me ask a question that's come through via social media, because we have publicized this event prior and some questions have already filtered through. And it just links to what you're saying, Max, where somebody says, how can small and medium scale enterprises, or small, medium enterprises, access loans in these fragile countries, because the financial architecture to a large extent has also been destroyed?
I think we as sort of come back to the issue of partnering, I think donors, the private sector, sort of governments, NGOs, we need to partner and build programs, sort of funds, which targets sort of the local SME sector. And I actually think that there's too little of funding program structure which actually targets local SMEs and have the ability to invest and fund in slightly more smaller sort of programs. So, yeah.
Something to think about. Minister, there was a question specifically around security. I'd like you to tackle that, and anything else you want to add.
Say that again.
So how are you responding to the questions that have been raised, and particularly the one about security?
Security, yes. Well, I would agree that businesses are very sensitive to security. Physical and security of the assets being lost. And therefore, as far as the fragility of Somalia is concerned, we are physically addressing the issue of security. We are fighting with terrorism in the country that is still there. On the security of the investment, we also have laws. We have the anti-corruption law approved. We have the business law. We have the company law. We have the PFM law. So we have tried over the last 2 years to put in place the necessary regulations in place that will guide the asset of the businesses. But I will say that every company specializing on everything, I think that the first thing that one does is come to the country and explore. and explore with your peers, the local businesses who have been doing this for a very long time. And I would think, to the extent that high risk is high return, companies that come there, I'm sure, and we have seen some, will stay there for the long haul.
Yeah.
Yes.
Eileen, do you want to add to anything that was said? We can. You don't have to.
I would just mention, because I didn't mention earlier, regarding job creation or livelihoods and employment of refugees, there has been a big push by the founder of Chobani, who's launched the Tent Partnership for Refugees, and I do think that that's a very positive step forward, and he is really making the business case, for example, for hiring refugees, and I think that's definitely a development that's worth looking into. Yeah.
Okay, we have an opportunity for one more round of questions. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. And the lady there. If you can, all three of you stand up, then the microphone knows to reach you. Sir, ma'am. And that's it. Yes, ma'am. The lady in white.
Hello. My name is Aissata Thiam. I'm an international consultant in technology. I want to commend all the panelists. This was a really informative discussion. I wanted to bring forward a couple of things. Women are in the center of everything. I haven't heard a lot about, women not only addressing the insecurity issues, trying to raise the families, the men are missing sometime in action because of various reasons. So what is your perspective about the essential role that women will play in, getting the job done in these fragile states?
Fantastic.
And the second one about the PPPs, the public-private partnerships, where did that come to play in fragile society? Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Mohib Jabarkhil. I'm a consultant on development affairs in Afghanistan. My question is with regard to private sector development in fragile states. From experience and from the readings and from this discussion, private sector development in fragile context is extremely important for both development, job creation, and a lot of these issues. On the other hand, there is a lot of risk in those countries. And as we heard from the panelists, investors are very reluctant to take that risk. So it creates a very difficult situation for financing private sector activities in those contexts. My question would be that in such situation, would it make sense that development aid through IDA or USAID or other donors play that financier role in supporting private sector development, then looking at the private sector themselves or investors who are very reluctant to take a risk despite MIGA's existence and others in fragile countries?
Thank you very much. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much. Carmini Poole from the Thomson Reuters Foundation, Head of Institutional Partnerships. My question is around the role of diaspora. We know that last year there was, I think, 223 billion that was mobilized in terms of remittances, excuse me. So in terms of looking at diversifying financing modalities, should we not consider that there is also, there's cultural linkage, particularly with, the population that is living in camps and do not have access to legal work? Thoughts?
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Shall we start with the last question? Because I know Somalia, really and truly,
Yes.
the diaspora has played an incredible role.
Yes. Diaspora for us is very important. It has kept the country together, and somebody spoke about women. I really believe that there are a number of studies that indicated that Somalia is still there because of the mother that kept the family together when men were fighting. And diaspora is the second issue, that bringing money, business people. Either like business people coming as business or sending remittances for the mother to survive, for the mother to keep the house together. And so really diaspora for us is very important. Today, diaspora is coming back. And diaspora is coming back with their skills, very important, and their capital, very important as well. And therefore, really, we depend on diaspora a lot.
Not because you're a woman, Eileen, but women are at the coalface, and they've got to survive the trauma, keep the family network going, and perhaps even source an income. What have you experienced with the Syrian refugees?
I mean, I can speak from the women we've worked with. I mean, it's also important to think of ways to provide them with the resources they need. So, I mean, obviously the work we do is wonderful for women. We have mothers who work from home, teaching, you know, sometimes with their babies on their laps. So, you know, I don't know if I have much more to say than what we all know about the importance of bringing women to the forefront because they can bring something different to the table as well. So I think, of course, in certain contexts, it's harder. We don't see enough women, you know, leading these projects. And of course, I'm not going to talk about how much capital goes to women, but of course, there needs to be more, you know, more investment. And it's, you know, it's exciting to see that there are many women-focused initiatives as well to support women entrepreneurs. So I think it is moving in a positive direction, slowly.
I'd just say journalistically, just sidebar, it's so important to have these images of Syrian women teaching English, Arabic, even with their babies on the back. It's a very empowering image, and it changes the media narratives as well. So we want to hear more and more about that. Public-private partnerships, obviously that works really well for rolling out big infrastructure and setting out concessions. Would it help in fragile states?
I think it wouldn't just help. I think it's essential, and I think we've touched on some of the themes earlier, whether it comes to blended finance products or even public-private partnerships on the actual delivery. I think essential in the fragile context. Essential, full stop. Just a word on the diaspora point. I think is a really important one because the diaspora also understands more the risk inherent in their home country, right? Just as we're talking about local investors before, diaspora also have an understanding. And the challenge is how do you get these massive pools? I think it was double the oil revenue in Nigeria was from diaspora spending last year, right? So these massive pools. How do you get it to not just go, not to dismiss it, back to their home villages, but how do you actually put together some funds and aggregated pools of diaspora capital could be game-changing.
Yeah. Yes, sir?
I just wanted to speak briefly about one of the major requirements of private sector to come to a country, and that is the availability of infrastructure in the country.
Yeah.
That is water, electricity, transportation, and telephone systems. Now, this is the cost of running a business when you come to a country. And most of the developing countries built all this with the help of IDA. We were talking about IDA. And Somalia has not had access to IDA for the last 30 years. And therefore, the reason that we have to address the issue of debt, do away with debt, is to get access to those resources so we can build transportation and energy. Now, Somalia, I was told, I know that Somalia has the highest per kilowatt electricity, the highest. And therefore, when business sees that, it's very discouraging and very costly. And so we need IDA to come in. Of course, MIGA is very important, and we are part of it. We are now a member. We have struggled, but we are a member. We have regained our membership.
Right.
But building all this infrastructure for businesses to come in is, I think, very important, and we are working on it.
Okay. Max, briefly.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to say a few words about the question on the role of women in the economy and gender equality, just to say that it's hugely important, and I think as donors, we should prioritize that, supporting sort of gender equality and women's role in the economy and private sector in all what we do. Just to give an example, recently we provided as Finland a long-term capital loan to our national DFI, FinFund, who invest in the private sector, and part of this, sort of big part of these funds are earmarked to support sort of women's businesses and investments sort of that strengthen the empowerment of women.
And just one more question from social media. It says, it's a long question, but basically, while the private sector is one of the major pathways out of the fragility trap, they sometimes can't succeed because of harsh business environments. You've mentioned the issue of a lack of electricity. They talk about heavy taxes that are levied on the small and medium enterprises. And supply chain was raised earlier on, distribution networks, the roads aren't working. So there's a whole measure of other interventions that are needed. And the question is how to fix that, how to find solutions to that.
Now, for us in Somalia, for example, the issue of taxes, it is the capacity to pay principle is what normally we are using. I think if you are not making money, there are no taxes. There was a negotiated kind of tax before the government came into place. The government went around and spoke to businesses, and something was given to the government. But today we have the rules and we have the laws, which takes into good consideration whether your business can thrive with heavy taxes. We don't want to discourage investment, and we take that into account when we are levying taxes.
All right, so let's wrap this conversation up and go back to the hashtag for this seminar. Hashtag get the job done. How will we get the private sector to join hands with multilateral agencies to get the job done? How?
As the private sector. Look, I clearly there's willingness and need on both sides, but I would argue that both sides are still relatively far apart. So to me, I keep coming back to this role of you need brokers, right? And you need people who speak both languages, and they are entirely different languages, at least I've learned. So I think the other thing I'll say is keep it really simple. Right? Sometimes I think the reaction to fragility and complexity is more complexity. And everyone's very smart in thinking of very smart projects and investments, and you try to engineer everything, and you can't. So one is, I would say, just simplicity, keep the moving pieces to one or two, because it's already hard enough.
Yep.
And the second, I think, is you need brokers, you need translators to get the job done.
Max?
I think we need sort of a couple of things. First, we need to actually sort of strongly prioritize the issue. We need to put emphasis on this sort of, and our focus, that's one. And secondly, I think we, governments, private sectors, sort of, we need to build partnerships to build actual sort of practical operations programs sort of that works in fragile countries.
Minister?
Yes, I agree with my colleagues. I think we have roles to play. We have roles to play, and we complement each other. The government has a role to play. We have to establish an appropriate platform for the private sector, secure platform, rules and regulations that will guide their investments. They have to also come and dutifully pay their taxes, and at the same time, of course. And at the same time explore what is possible, and take some of the risks with the profit that come with it.
Fantastic. Aileen?
Of course, I'm speaking from a much smaller, small enterprise startup perspective, but what I think often is stopping this, the progress regarding the private sector is thinking too big all the time, and sometimes just accepting that you can start small and that could actually trigger something massive. I mean, personally, I never thought Netaka. I mean, I was just looking for ways to practice my Arabic from New York City when I came up with the idea for Natakallam. So I think that being more specific to context, accepting that if you take smaller risks, it's less costs, and then just see if that works, and then grow from there. And I think the local partners, the middle person is very helpful, and private sector can work with the small enterprises to get to a result eventually. So I think really thinking a little bit more that way will help as well.
So ladies and gentlemen, that's been our conversation on private sector and fragile situations. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much, everybody.